I'm super excited to have Ken back to present to us. Ken got his degree in zoology from the University of Maine and his PhD in zoology from the University of North Carolina. He studied imperiled birds with the University of Florida and then as a research biologist with the National Park System or Service. He co-founded a super awesome group called ARCI, or the Avian Research and Conservation Institute, that does incredible work on swallow-tailed kites, crested caracaras, white-crowned pigeons, and a bunch of other really neat birds. And he has studied the behavior and ecology of 21 species of birds, conservation concern in North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean Basin. So now that I've introduced you, all good for you to start your presentation, and I can't wait to see what you have for us today.
Very good. Thank you, Blair. Thank you all for sitting in on this. I'm going to try to give you an overview of, very quick overview, and just want to emphasize that I and Gina Kent, who's ARCI's other primary employee, we're here, we're available anytime you have questions, interests, about anything you think we're studying or might be studying or considering studying. As you may have gathered, the nonprofit that I direct, Avian Research and Conservation Institute, is its mission is to study birds that are rare, imperiled, declining, regardless of whether they are formally listed as threatened or endangered by any of the state or federal agencies. So we identify problems where data that we can collect, often by doing telemetry study, tracking studies, the data that we can collect can inform, encourage, promote, enable management actions that will make these birds less at risk. So what Blair had asked is that I speak about some of the birds that are less well known, or that we usually don't talk about. I know that Gina is going to make presentations on swallowtail kites and maybe snail kites at some point coming up soon. So we don't just study raptors. That was my primary interest in graduate school, and actually going through undergraduate. I focused on raptors. Plenty of problems there. Populations of predators often are at risk. Contaminants are an issue. Migration can be an issue where they face threats in other parts of the world. But we also study several species of wading birds and a couple of seabirds, and the mangrove cuckoo and the white-crowned pigeon, which are don't fit into any of those other categories. So I'm going to move very quickly and let the pictures speak 1,000 words at least, so that I can not take too long, not take too much of your time listening, and then we'll go into question and answer period and any comments you want to have. So two of the wading birds that we are most interested in are the Reddish Egret and the great white heron, because they're the only two species of wading birds that are declining in Florida. The other species, as you all may know, the populations of wading birds took a big dive 100 years ago and earlier, because they were hunted for their feathers to be used in hats. I mean, that sounds like, oh, how can that possibly put at risk species with hundreds of thousands of birds? Well, the populations are never quite as big probably as people thought, and they certainly were not limitless or capable of supporting the wholesale slaughter that they faced for this hat trade. Reddish egrets occur in two color morphs. That's one really cool thing about birds. Some birds occur in what are called, used to be called phases, but it's not something that changes through their life. They're either light or dark their entire life. A lot of raptors, same way, they have light and dark color morphs. The short-tailed hawk, which we studied, but I'm probably not going to talk about today. Gina may touch on that. They occur in light and dark morphs that are either one or the other. Just another of the many interesting things about birds. Birds are spectacular to look at, and that's one reason they attract so much attention. But technically, when we're studying conservation, the ecology of the planet in face of climate change and other things that we're trying to protect wildlife from, birds are conspicuous to biologists as they are to the public, and their behavior and their ecological needs, their population opportunities for monitoring are better than most species of plants and animals, frankly. So they serve as good indicators of environmental quality. So getting back to reddish egrets, two color morphs, you see an antenna sticking up on the back of one of them. That's how we got these tracking data that you see here in the lower Florida Keys. Each color represents, of those dots, represents a different individual. And what we learned by tracking reddish egrets, which number no more than about 350 pairs in the state of Florida, what we learned is that there are very sedentary, site faithful. And what that means is they don't travel far during the year. They stick around right where they nest, probably very close to where they hatched from an egg. These are satellite tracks. So what happens is we put these small devices, which you can see on that bird here on the top. All you see is the antenna sticking up, the actual transmitters down in the feathers. And so what we do is we put these transmitters on, but they also have a little GPS receiver in them, and that sends back highly accurate location data. And so we can see these 5 birds represented here by the 5 different colors of spaghetti on this map. This is around Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, Cape Coral, south of Fort Myers. These 5 reddish egrets, these were their entire home ranges. What you see here, 3 birds, I'll show you with my cursor. These 3 birds over here, blue, red, and green, were tagged on Ding Darling National Wildlife out on Sanibel Island, and the other 2 nearby on county lands right along the coast. Reddish egrets are very secretive. They nest on mangrove islands offshore, just like great white herons do, and many of Florida's wading birds do. But they don't occur in big colonies. If there's only 350 pairs in the state of Florida, then their colonies are actually very small, maybe 3, 4, 5 nests of reddish egrets totally. Reddish egrets and great white herons also are very interesting in that they live in what are called marine environments, in other words, saltwater on the coast, whereas most of Florida's egrets and herons live, nest, forage, catch fish and other prey in freshwater systems. We can learn a lot about nesting birds and what kills them, the predators on nestlings and on eggs, for instance, by putting cameras at nests. And we did some of that with reddish egrets down in the Keys. We identified anhingas as being a threat to nesting reddish egrets, but also black rats, which get up, and raccoons are also a problem, but black rats are not commonly seen, but they're really very numerous, and they kill the young or they eat the eggs of many species. The great white heron is moving on here quickly through the species. Great white herons are as big as a great blue heron, but you will not see them anywhere near as often or anywhere near the range in Florida that you would see great blue herons. The great white herons are marine, again, just saltwater, and they thrive in the lower Keys. That's where their nests are. And again, just as with the reddish egrets, year round. Now this is a satellite image of the lower Keys down around Big Pine Key, east of Key West. And these are the home ranges of 5 great white herons. This is it. They spend their lives in these small areas. And we use different analytical techniques with the tracking data, the GPS data, to see what kind of habitats they're most strongly associated with. What are the habitats that they need to keep their population stable or growing? The population size for great white herons is really not much bigger than it is for reddish egrets, but they perhaps are a little bit more stable than reddish egrets. They also occur in the Caribbean, as do reddish egrets. Okay, so these maps here, these are great white herons, and each color in this map over here, these colored dots, each one represents a different individual. And what we learned by running some statistical tests on the tracking data is that the most important habitat for these birds, especially when they're feeding young, are the dark green areas on this habitat map here. And that's large expanses of marine, of oceanic seagrass beds. Seagrass is the nursery for all the fish that live in this ecosystem, not all, but most of the fish, and certainly the fish that people go out to fish for recreationally out in deep water and spend millions and millions of dollars a year in Florida. Unfortunately, conservation can't be measured. Its value can't be measured in a dollar value, because how do you put a dollar value on the enjoyment we get and the ecological ways in which birds function? It's impossible. It's priceless. But the marine grass that the seagrass beds that great white herons rely on are shrinking because they get damaged by all the motorboat traffic in the lower keys. And you can see this when you look at some of the tracks around the island. This is hurricane damage. This is from Hurricane Irma, which occurred right after we had surveyed great white herons and found that their population is stable compared to surveys in the previous 10 years. This water all should be this beautiful blue-green color. All the mangrove trees should be green. This is all hurricane damage. Just within a matter of a few hours, this ecosystem was very, very heavily beaten up by the passage of Hurricane Irma. And yet the great white herons are still nesting in there. So the problems, the challenges for great white herons are small, isolated, declining populations. They rely on seagrass, which is disappearing, which affects a lot of resources, not just birds and not just great white herons. They occur over in Texas too. They nest in bigger numbers in one place on the coast of Texas, the Gulf Coast. But we know from our tracking studies, this is a very important result. Great white herons in Florida and Texas don't move back and forth. So if the great white heron goes extinct in Florida, it is very unlikely that, certainly in our lives or any reasonable time period, that they're going to be replaced, recolonized, kick-started again as a population by birds moving over from Texas. It just doesn't happen. All right, moving on, the magnificent frigatebird. A lot of you have probably seen these birds along the coast. You might mistake them with a swallowtail kite, but they have an 8-foot wingspan. They stay in the air almost all day. They live by catching fish, especially flying fish, out of the ocean. And yet, if they go into the water, they cannot get out. And the salt water will do enough damage to their feathers that they will probably not survive. So this is just one of many amazing stories about this species, but it gives you an indication of the kinds of things that we barely know about birds that make them so amazing. How does this bird stay in the air, have the energy to fly all day, all night, forage for food far away from where they nest, come back and feed their young by disgorging fish that they catch? And yet, in this environment, getting into the water is perilous for them. They will not survive. They, in the United States, they only nest down in southern Florida, basically in the Keys, out on one island, out in the Great Tortugas, the Dry Tortugas, which are about 70 miles or so west of Key West. They used to nest up near Key West, but they were disturbed by all the boating activity and recreational boating activity. And they moved out to the more remote sites out in the Dry Tortugas. And unfortunately, they have very few trees to nest in out there. So what you see, the circle on the right is where they winter. And the circle here in the middle, the Marquesas Keys, is where they used to nest. And the colony was rather small, maybe 250 nests at the most. That's the whole US population. And now they're all the way out here in the Dry Tortugas, where there is very little habitat, mangrove forest for them to nest in. So we learned a lot about them by catching them at night in a boat where you can't use any lights because they would be spooked. So it's tricky, needless to say. Put transmitters on them and collect these tracking data. So what we captured were wintering birds that came from the Caribbean breeding population and would winter up here in the Florida Keys. So we studied 5 of those birds, and we found that, yeah, they nest down here around the Yucatan Peninsula and over on Cuba and farther east in the Caribbean. And yet there's so much fish, so many such large fish populations for them to feed on in southern Florida that they actually come north in the wintertime, unusual for a migratory bird. So that says how good how productive Florida is for magnificent frigatebirds in terms of catching food. And yet we have one small breeding population down to maybe 150 pairs. And that's because of the disturbance that our recreational activities, even in these remote areas in the lower Keys, how much we're disturbing these birds, and it limits their opportunity to breed and make enough babies and raise them to breeding age. Frigatebirds don't breed till they're 5 to 8 years old. So the young have to make it a long time as they're learning how to forage and learning how to nest. This is a female on the right and a male on the left. They're really, really spectacular birds. That's an adult on the left and a young bird on the right. And as is true of many birds, whether they're warblers or big seabirds or raptors, the young are downy. In the early stage, they shed this down and they develop flight feathers in a matter of a few weeks or a few months. And they start flying when they are 3, 4, 5, 6 months old. And they become expert flyers by the time they reach their first birthday. Imagine you having to learn to fly by the time you're 7 months old and being able to survive by the time you're a year old. Obviously, you're not going to achieve that anytime in your life. Things we take for granted about birds that are just spectacular. You can, as the scientists, we have to be objective. We have to be credible. We have to act like we're impartial and not swayed so much by the beauty of birds and the amazing things they do, but rather the factual information, because we're trying to be scientists. But it's impossible not to be moved by the challenges that birds face, especially in the world we've created, and how they overcome them and how they survive for thousands and thousands of years, and how great an impact we can have by our activities in just a very short time, to the point where we push these populations to the brink. How did we catch them? Well, or how do we attract them to places where we want them to nest? We use decoys, and we make the decoys out of plastic decoys that you can buy, that hunters buy for different species. But we do things like cut the bills off and put on different bills and add tails and then paint them to look like the species we're trying to catch. So here's a picture of a site down in the Keys where we're trying to attract frigatebirds to nest. There's playbacks going on in the background there. All the vocalizations of frigatebirds to make them feel comfortable so that they come into this island and consider nesting there. We're trying to attract them to places where they can nest safely without human disturbance, so that the population has an insurance policy, basically, that they can breed successfully on more than just one tiny island way out in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's only one living bird in that picture. That's the bird with the white head. It's a young of the year that was attracted to all these other apparent frigatebirds, which are decoys. They're all fake birds. We even have one in there. This is a male. They can puff up their pouch in their throat that's bright red, and that's how they attract females. It makes them look like a more attractive mate if they can inflate that pouch really large and hold it for a while. Another amazing thing. You could talk for days and days and days about the breeding behavior of birds. So now we'll switch to another imperiled bird in the same Caribbean, Florida range as the frigatebird, and that's the white-crowned pigeon. Up until the 1960s, this beautiful columbid, as they're called, the group of pigeons and doves, it's the only U.S. population is in southern Florida, especially in the Keys. They nest in mangrove islands. They feed on the fruit of hardwood trees, hardwoods that grow in what are called hammocks, not the kind you sleep in, but a small forest or even just clumps of Caribbean trees, Caribbean species. They're extremely hardwood and they produce fruit. So this bird lives entirely on the fruit of wild Caribbean hardwood trees that are being lost because of hurricane damage. We have more hurricanes now. We have more intense hurricanes with climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So one way we study them, as with other birds, is with telemetry. In the hand there, you see that this is a small satellite transmitter, solar powered, the smallest ever made, the second smallest ever made. We used this when it was the smallest ever made, and we put them on white-crowned pigeons and we tracked them. And what we learned was that the Florida breeding population goes out to Cuba and to the Bahamas for the winter. And in both of those places, white-crowned pigeons, until recently in Cuba, but still in the Bahamas, have been heavily hunted for sport. In the Bahamas, they had a 6-month hunting season. They've shortened it, and you could shoot up to 100 a day. Their population could not sustain that kind of harvest in quotes. And as a result, what was happening is the Bahamian hunters were shooting young birds from the US that were migrating from Florida out to the Bahamas and to Cuba, where they used to hunt. And these young pigeons from the Florida population, which is the only place in the US where they nest, they were being killed by hunters in other places. So that's a very short version of the white-crowned pigeon story. We've done a lot of trips, a lot of talks, a lot of cooperative work with the Bahamian Natural Resource Agency and the Bahamas National Trust, and trying to inform them and encourage them so they can manage their hunting a lot more restrictively, more conservatively, in ways that will sustain the population. It's an uphill battle. But it's not fair to just point a finger at them and say they're responsible for us losing this breeding population in Florida, when in fact, we're destroying the tropical hardwood forests in South Florida that these birds rely on, except in the places where those forests can persist, like in Everglades National Park or on the small refuge lands in the Florida Keys. So here's another bird very out of character for us, the mangrove cuckoo. So most of the cuckoos we have in Florida are called the yellow-billed cuckoo, and their calls are quite conspicuous. They're in hardwood forests. They're always hard to see, but you can see them, and birders like the challenge of trying to see them. And what you do is first you listen for their distinctive call. They have a very loud, very beautiful song or call. Combination of things. The calls are shorter. Songs in birds tend to be more complex, and calls tend to be shorter and less complex, melodically and harmonically. But because it lives in the forest, the mangrove cuckoos keep tabs on each other by calling, and birders rarely see them. Birders are very happy just to hear a mangrove cuckoo call. And their vocalizations are different than yellow-billed cuckoos. You can tell them apart. They occur on the coastal islands in the southern Everglades and down in the Keys, but mangrove cuckoos are aptly named. They live in the mangrove forest. And I don't know how many of you, I'm sure you, well, I hope you have seen mangrove forest if you've been to Central and South Florida coasts. But I wonder how many of you may have tried to walk around in one. It's extremely difficult. The foliage is dense. They have roots that spread all over the place to hold them up in the muddy, tidal soil that they grow in. So mangrove cuckoos take advantage of this. They're small birds, so hawks and falcons could hunt them if they could find them. But this is one way that birds avoid predation. They become adapted behaviorally to nest in very dense forests. So how do we catch them? Well, first of all, we have to raise money to do all this work. And these folks were some of the donors, the friends of the National Wildlife Refuge there. Ding Darling's a great place to go birding, by the way. There's a wildlife drive. You can just drive and stop periodically and see all kinds of things. And you will hear mangrove cuckoos. And if you're lucky, you might see one just from the drive. That little transmitter that you saw here is what it's like when you're trying to put it on the bird. The hands belong to Amanda Powell, who's worked with us for many years. And she got particularly good at attaching them. You can't even see the transmitter. It's so small, they're under her fingers, but she's trying to tie a knot in the material used to attach the transmitter to the bird. That's Amanda removing the removing a cuckoo from the mist net. So the way we catch them is we carry this mist net, as you can see, it's very, very fine, and poles that are only about 8 feet high. We carry them, we carry a little recorded playback system with external speakers and our binoculars and a blind that we can hide in so the bird can't see us. And we walk trails in mangrove cuckoo habitat. These are elevated trails. We're not walking through the forest because you don't go anywhere very fast. But we listen for the calls of mangrove cuckoos. And when we hear them, we set up the net, we put out a decoy. The best one we had is one that Amanda made and painted to look like a real mangrove cuckoo. So we put the decoy at the center and below the net, and then we play a tape recording back of a mangrove cuckoo calling back to the one that is vocalizing. And they're very territorial, and they're also very curious. And so they'll stop calling, the wild birds, they'll stop calling and sneak in to get a look at what's making this call. And they'll see the decoy and then suddenly fly at it. And in the course of doing so, if we're lucky, they land in the mist net. And we're right there. We take them out immediately. We take as little time as necessary to very safely handle them, band them, and put the transmitter on them. That makes it all sound very, very fun. And it is indeed fun all the time, but especially fun when you catch something. But you spend most of your time not catching something and having a nice time out there seeing and hearing lots and lots of birds. But it is hard work, but it pays off in terms of the information we can get. That's Gina Kent on the left, whom I mentioned. Gina and I have worked together now for 22 years, and Amanda on the right, putting up the net. So they just heard a cuckoo call, and they're going to try to lure it in. Indigo Central, that's a trail, and that's what we named this particular cuckoo. In the upper left, you can see the solar-powered transmitter. That blue piece of fabric is covering the bird's head. Most birds, when they can't see, they calm down. And we lower their stress levels by keeping their heads covered with a small hood or some fabric or something. And it takes about 20 minutes to band them, weigh them, measure them, attach the radio, and release them. And then we monitor their well-being after that for as long as we can keep track of them to make sure they're okay. So these little squares, this represents the movements of 6 different birds. So our research question in studying these birds on Sanibel Island was, they have a consistent, fairly healthy breeding population there. Excuse me, but nobody knows where they go for the winter. They're still there. They'll occasionally call, but people have suspected that most of them migrate down to South America, or at least places in the Caribbean. But nobody knew until we did this study just a few years ago. And what we determined was that in the wintertime, birds that we tagged on Sanibel in the springtime, they do move during the breeding season. And like most migrants in the northern hemisphere, they go north for the summer, where the days are longer and there's going to be more food available. It's not just cooler when you go north. But did you ever wonder why all the migratory birds in Florida, the songbirds, like all the species of warblers we get here that winter here, did you ever wonder why they go so far north, like up to New England and eastern Canada, to breed in what's called the northern or the boreal forest? Well, the real reason they go up there to breed is that the days are much longer than they are here in Florida. At the extreme, if you get up to the Arctic Circle, it's daytime most of the time in the middle of the summer. But the days are longer throughout the summer, and that produces more food. It makes plants grow faster. Therefore, it makes insects reproduce and become more numerous during the summer. And then the birds that feed on the insects, and then the birds that feed on the birds that feed on the insects, all have a lot more food because the days are much longer. And then when it comes time to survive the winter, they migrate back to the south to winter down here. So anyway, getting back to mangrove cuckoos, the answer is yes, they migrate. They migrate northward to breed in the spring, but they only go about 10 miles just up here to Pine Island and Cape Coral, the margins, the mangrove forest along the edges of these land masses. And then at the end of the summer, presumably they go back down to Sanibel for the winter. These transmitters are so small, they don't last very long. But this was the first window anybody had into whether or not mangrove cuckoos are migratory. And that really makes a big difference because this is a very small population. It's very much at risk of declining and disappearing, and we wouldn't even know about it. And if we don't know where they spend the winter, we don't know what kind of threats they face, say from pesticides or from hurricanes while they're migrating, I mean, that sort of thing. They're just, you know, I look at a picture like this and I say, they're just such beautiful creatures. They're such intriguing and fascinating animals and just pieces of life on planet Earth. But, you know, every single species is so, they're also distinctively their own. They are unique. So the stories, the beautiful things about them, it's almost limitless. That's one of the things that makes birding such an incredible hobby, sport, pastime, profession, you know. There's lots of work that's needed to protect and conserve birds, especially in Florida. And most people get started studying birds because they became interested in going out and enjoying them recreationally as birders. So we all want to encourage young people to do so and want to do more than just say that, want to help you in ways that we might be able to by sharing information or by giving you advice if you're interested in careers that are related to this. Doing what we do in the field is certainly not the only way to help these populations. So don't think you have to do that. There's lots of ways you can contribute to conservation of birds and species in general. Climate change, yeah, sorry to be leaving you guys with this. It certainly was not the intention of those of us who have been watching for 40 years, the US population and the rest of the world ignore what has been a reality that's been coming. And now we have to face the consequences and try to stop it from happening any further while we still can. I'm going to go back up to the slide at the beginning here and wrap up, but I've only talked about a few birds in detail. And let me just do this again here. So this is just sort of a collage of some of the birds, other birds that we're studying right now too. But there's some that aren't even on here. I'm not even sure what all is covered. There's short-tailed hawks down there in the lower right. We've tracked great horned owls to learn about them because they're the major predator of the swallowtail kite, which Gina's going to talk about, the bird in the upper left. The snail kite, vaguely similar to the swallowtail kite in how they fly and catch prey, but that's about it. Swallowtail kites eat just about everything. Snail kites eat one thing almost entirely. Snail kites are endangered. Swallowtail kites were thought to be declining, but that appears to be an improved situation. They seem to be doing better gradually. And the main reason is that, excuse me, they do well feeding, nesting and feeding in landscapes that have a lot of commercial timber management and harvest. We're lucky because timber harvest is very productive in the southeastern US. And that's why we still have a swallowtail kite population. It's a little complicated, but a beautiful story, how timber management mimics natural ecological succession, which the term a lot of you may not have heard, most of you may not have heard, but it's just a way to describe how what happens to living communities on a piece of land, a landscape, a state, a piece of property, how things move through time, change through time, succeeding from one stage to another, from bare ground up to mature stands of vegetation. And as the vegetation changes over time, so do the animals, all the animals, including insects and birds and fish and reptiles and amphibians, how they all change accordingly. So that's a whole other story in itself, and Gina will talk about that. But I'm just going to leave you with just a quick mention of two of the funnest species I've ever studied, partly because they're just so lovable. Burrowing owls, Florida burrowing owls, and the American kestrel. So both of these species, they're small raptors. The Florida populations of each of these species are considered distinctive, to the point of almost being separate species genetically. Both of them are imperiled because they're small, they're very vulnerable to predators, but they're also very vulnerable to losing their habitat to development. And they're losing the quality of water and the prey populations, the insect populations they live on. And so there hasn't been a lot of work on either of these species. The Florida population is known as the southeastern American kestrel, and it's steadily declining as the species is all over the United States. But we're doing telemetry studies, old-fashioned radio tracking studies on southeastern American kestrels and Florida burrowing owls as I speak, to try to understand what happens when they are displaced because their habitat is lost, but also how we can take care of the habitats that they rely on so that we can maintain healthy populations, so that the populations don't get so small that one hurricane or a very dry year with a lot of forest fires could basically wipe out the small remaining populations where they're most numerous. So I'm going to stop here, and again, just encourage you to get in touch. Blair is extremely well informed. I'm always impressed when I talk with him and see how much he has learned. But I'm sure that you all have your interests and your own rate of growing what you know about birds, and your own goals and what you want to do. So get in touch with us. Happy to come back anytime and do more of these kinds of talks, can focus on particular species. But I thank you for your interest here today. Thanks for being patient, letting me get started. But I also just thank you for caring, for loving the natural world, and for wondering how you can help save these birds. You know, really one of the best ways that I've found is just to share your enthusiasm. Why are you so intrigued by these creatures, and why do you love them, and why does it make you feel bad to think of living in a world without them? So I thank you very, very much. I admire what you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ken. That was great. It's really,
Thanks,
really
Blair.